84-year-old Dr. John Khaminwa is old enough to have retired from his profession like any other Kenyan, but for the love of law, Khaminwa is still a practicing senior counsel, living in a quiet, leafy suburb of Karen in Nairobi. 84 years and counting, you're still on the corridors of justice with over 50 years of experience. What has glued you to this profession despite your age?
I love appearing before the courts. It does not matter what kind of court at all. A magistrate's court, high court, court of appeal, Supreme Court. I love appearing before the magistrates, appearing before the judges. Occasionally I'm rebuked by magistrates or I'm rebuked by judges, but I receive it well. That may explain why I have continued to enjoy some measure of good health. And God willing, I'll continue practicing law.
As a professional lawyer, Khaminwa has been a state counsel, a resident magistrate in the High Court of Kenya, deputy registrar in the High Court, principal legal secretary with the East African Community EAC, where he rose to the position of deputy counsel.
I rose to the position of deputy counsel to the community, which was a very high position. During those days, it was number 3 after the Secretary General of the East African Community. I enjoyed the status of a senior counsel as deputy counsel of the community. Occasionally, I attended the meetings of members of the authority, who at that time were Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, Milton Obote, and Julius Nyerere. It was in 1973, I believe it may have been a little bit earlier, when I decided to quit the East African community. I enjoyed my work in the East African community.
However, he resigned from his lucrative job in 1973 from the East African community to join private legal practice.
My Lord, Attorney General of the country.
Before he became an esteemed lawyer, Khaminwa went through uncountable trials, including fearing for his own life.
The African community provided a good opportunity to expand my international jurisprudence. Unfortunately, Amin came into power, and a lot of lawyers were assassinated during Amin's time. This was a time when Chief Justice Kiwanuka was assassinated for releasing a Briton on bail. And I recall one evening arriving at home in Arusha, and I told my wife, Joyce, that we were returning to Kenya, because I had sensed that my own personal security was in danger, because I was handling matters relating to the 3 countries. My wife was then working in the South African community as a registrar. We then decided to return to Kenya, and we set up a legal practice in Kenya, the 2 of us as partners.
During the single-party system, detention without trial was a norm in Kenya, and Khaminwa, being a human rights defender, could not escape the wrath of Moi's government for representing the high and the mighty in Kenya's courts. Khaminwa was detained not once but twice, with many others who had the audacity to question Moi's powers on some critical issues. Khaminwa's tribulations began when he first represented the then Deputy Director of Intelligence, Mwangi Stephen Muriithi, and argued that the president had no powers to dismiss Muriithi, since the latter was an employee of the Public Service Commission who could only be fired after disciplinary action by an independent tribunal.
The first detention I suffered was because I was representing someone who had been a Deputy Director of Intelligence, Mr. Mwangi Stephen Muriithi. Mwangi Stephen Muriithi had been my contemporary at Alliance High School. He approached me and asked me if I could represent him in court, because at that time the president had transferred him from Directorate of Intelligence to become General Manager of Uplands Bacon Factory. He objected very strongly because he loved being a Director of Intelligence. We went to court and challenged this and said to the court that as a president, he did not have the power of transferring public servants at all. Then President Moi did not like this at all. And it's not surprising that it ended up by my being detained by him. Of course, I had been also handling other cases which he did not like, cases like of George Anyona, cases involving Prime Minister Raila Odinga, who was then just an ordinary person. That was the first detention. I was detained at Kamiti, then moved to Manyani, then moved to Hola, and then moved to Naivasha.
In 1982, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga and George Anyona, former political detainees, were returned to house arrest and detention respectively for attempting to launch an opposition party. Their families retained Khaminwa to challenge the detention. The beginning of the 1990s political opposition to Moi's rule re-emerged, and some of its advocates were Oginga Odinga and politicians like Raila Odinga, Kenneth Matiba, Charles Rubia and others, who were detained without trial at the beginning of July 1990.
The second detention was because I went to police station at traffic headquarters. It was then the provincial police headquarters, and wanted to see whether I could get Kenneth Matiba, who had been my contemporary at Alliance High School, and Charles Rubia released on bail. I met a provincial police officer who was very friendly. We exchanged pleasantries. He gave me a cup of tea. I was accompanied by Mr. Japheth Shamala, who had been an old friend of mine since primary school days. He had worked up to the post of permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was a qualified lawyer, a very able lawyer. After talking to one another, the provincial police officer said that he wanted to see me alone. I told him that, look, I am with my colleague here. I would better see you two of us. He said, no, I just want to see you alone. So I reluctantly agreed. I thought he was going to tell me something very confidential, which I would then tell my friend, Mr. Japheth Shamala. As we stood up and walked a few yards from where we had been sitting, he told me that you have been detained. It came to me as a great shock. I was taken to Kamiti, then to Manyani, where I met Ibrahim Mohammed, who had also been detained because he had refused to disclose the name of his tribe, I think, to the administrative officers. One stayed in a small room alone. There was nothing, at the beginning there was nothing to read. Eventually we were given 1 or 2 books, the Holy Bible and the Quran to read, and nothing else at all. And there was a small pot where one could make susu, or in some cases poo-poo, and nothing more. They were very primitive conditions, extremely primitive conditions. And this was actually inherited from the colonial system. That's the way Mau Mau detainees used to be treated. We went through a very primitive process. And it's not surprising that a number of these people who were detained during Daniel Arap Moi's period have died. And those who were detained during the time of Mzee Jomo Kenyatta also have died. The only ones who have been able to rise to positions of prominence in public service are Willie Mutunga, who was recently our Chief Justice and performed very well as Chief Justice. He rendered very able services. He was able to maintain independence of the judges during the time of Mwai Kibaki, and he did extremely well. Raila Odinga, of course, was able to rise and become a prime minister. And Mohammed Ibrahim has risen to become a Supreme Court judge. These are the only ones who have been able to rise to positions of prominence in public service.
Those who questioned Moi's rules and directives then had bumpy lives whose damages even extended to their supportive family members.
At that time, I had a very young family. I had very young 2 children. My first child was Albert. The second child was Anne. Unfortunately, I've lost Albert. Albert died. I've buried him in this compound. I had educated him at a great expense. He went through the good schools of the country. He was at Warwick University, where he got a Bachelor of Laws and a Master of Laws degree. He died at an early age. Also, I have lost my wife, Joyce. And I would say that to some extent, I can say that these detentions did contribute and adversely affected their health. And it's not surprising that they have died early. My wife, late Joyce, who was my partner in legal practice and who rose to the position of being a judge of the High Court. She stood firmly behind me. She made considerable contribution to what I've been able to achieve in life. When I was detained, she walked barefooted for all the time I was in detention. As a mark of respect for me, their bodies, their remains are buried here. I remain grateful to them. They made a contribution to what I have been able to achieve in life. My brother, Charles Ford Khaminwa, a very brilliant person, a very brilliant human being. He was at the top of the whole country in his A levels. He got a Bachelor of Laws degree from Nairobi University. Went to Columbia University, where he got a master's degree in laws. He was a consultant. He had to leave the country when he found that his life was in danger and he was under constant surveillance. He went and settled in Zimbabwe. He died immediately after the death of my wife and my son. These were very great human beings to me.